the weekend Paula learned who held her mortgage. The kitchen timer went off at 6:40 in the morning, and I lifted the lid on a pot of white beans that had been soaking since the night before, and for the first time in almost a year, I noticed that my hands were not doing that small, private thing they had been doing, the tightening and releasing they had learned without asking my permission. Paula was sitting at the far end of the table with a mug of the instant chicory she now drinks because coffee makes her shake worse than it used to, and she was reading the appointment card for her Thursday therapy session out loud to herself, the way a person reads a bus schedule in a country whose language they are still learning. She did not look up at me, and she did not need to, because the argument was over, and had been over since a certain Saturday in June, and both of us knew it in the quiet, mineral way you know a bone has finally set. I stirred the beans. She turned the card over in her fingers. Outside, one of the almond growers 2 properties down was already running his shaker rig, and the sound of it came across the flat fields like a distant applause that had nothing to do with either of us. The image I keep coming back to is smaller than you would think. It is not the courthouse, and it is not the moment the whole thing broke open. It is a phone lying face up on the hood of a truck in the parking lot of the Los Rincones Community Church on a warm night in May, with my own voice coming out of its little speaker, saying a sentence I had never said in my life, in a tone I had never used, admitting to something I had never done. My voice. My accent, the one I have carried from Skopje through 31 years and 4 states, the flattened vowels I have never quite sanded off. Saying the thing that would have taken everything from me if a single person in that lot had believed it. That is the picture. A phone on a truck hood and my own voice betraying me while I stood there, unable to make it stop. To understand the beans and the timer, and the fact that my hands were still, you have to know what happened last spring. And to tell that properly, I have to go back further than the deepfake, further than the church parking lot, all the way back to the woman I was before any of them thought I was worth lying about. I came to this country when I was 24, in the winter of 1994, with 1 duffel bag and a cousin's address in Modesto written on the inside of my wrist in ballpoint because I did not trust myself to keep a piece of paper. I had trained as a lathe operator in a state factory that made pump housings, and in Macedonia that was a respectable trade for a woman, and in California in 1994 it was a small miracle that anyone let me near a machine at all. My first supervisor at a shop off Crow's Landing Road was a man named Big Ed Ruiz, who watched me set up a job for 3 days without a single word, and on the 4th day he grunted and put me on the swing shift and never questioned me again. And that grunt was, in its way, one of the great compliments of my life. I have spent 30 years making things out of metal that other people bolt into engines and irrigation pumps, and for a while into surgical frames for a company called North Star Bio that supplied half the orthopedic clinics in the valley. I know what a thing is worth by the weight of it in my hand. I mention this because it matters to the rest. When you spend your life on a floor where a part is either intolerance or it is scrap, where the caliper does not care about your feelings or your accent or how tired you are, you develop a particular relationship with the truth. The truth is a dimension you can measure. It does not argue. You just have to be patient enough and precise enough to bring it into the light. I met Gordon Merriweather in 2009 at a wedding for one of the shop foremen, where I was the woman standing by the coat rack because dancing has never once tempted me, and he was the widower standing near the same coat rack for reasons he later admitted were entirely about avoiding his sister-in-law. He was a foreman himself at a cannery in Turlock, a big, slow, careful man who read every warranty before he signed anything and kept his receipts in labeled envelopes by month. His first wife, Diane, had died of ovarian cancer in 2006, and he had raised their daughter mostly alone through the worst of it. And that daughter was Paula, who was 19 when I met her, and who I want to describe fairly because fairness is the only weapon I have ever fully trusted. Paula, in 2009, was a soft, watchful girl who laughed a half second after everyone else, as if she were checking the room to see whether laughing was allowed. She had her father's slowness, without his steadiness, and she had lost her mother at the exact age when a girl most needs one. And I understood from the first afternoon I spent in that house that whatever I became to her, I would never be Diane, and I never once tried to be. I married Gordon in the spring of 2011 in the back room of a Basque restaurant in Fresno with 14 guests and a borrowed ring because the sizing on mine had not come back in time. And Paula stood up during the little dinner and gave a toast that I have never forgotten, in which she said that she was glad her father had found someone who was, and I am quoting her exactly, still standing after everything life had run at her. I thought at the time it was the kindest thing anyone had ever said about me. I still think so. It is one of the reasons the later years cut the way they did. For a long time, we were good. Not close in the way of television families, but good in the way of two women learning to share a kitchen. Paula would come by on Sundays, and I taught her to make the tavche gravche, the baked beans with the paprika and the dried pepper that my own mother made. And she taught me how the American medical billing system worked, which she understood far better than I ever will, because she went into it for a living, coding and billing for a chain of clinics out of a beige office park in Merced. We had a rhythm, Gordon between us like a warm, slow river. I want you to hear that it was real, the good part, because the people who later doubted me forgot it had ever existed, and I never did. The erosion, when it came, did not come from Paula first. It came from a woman named Courtney Delacroix, and I will be precise about her, because precision is how I have survived her. Courtney married Paula's cousin Dale in 2016 and installed herself in the family like a splinter you cannot see but feel every time you close your hand. She was a loud, bright, relentless woman who sold a line of supplements through what she called her downline. And she had a genius, a true genius, for finding the exact soft place in a person and pressing on it until it bruised. She found Paula's soft place within a month. Paula, who had never quite believed she was worth loving, who checked the room before she laughed, was the perfect raw material. And Courtney went to work on her the way I go to work on a rough casting, patiently removing everything that did not serve the shape she wanted. And the shape Courtney wanted was a follower, someone to fill her sales meetings, to repeat her opinions back to her with a half-second delay, to resent the people Courtney resented. Courtney resented me from the beginning, and it took me 2 years to understand why. And the answer, when I found it, was almost too small to say out loud. I did not buy her supplements. That was the whole of it. At a 4th of July gathering in 2017, she cornered me by the cooler and gave me the full pitch for a powder that was supposed to fix my knees, my sleep, and my mood. And I told her, in my blunt factory way, that my knees were the knees of a woman who had stood on concrete for 23 years, and no powder was going to give me back 1994. I meant it as a joke about myself. She took it as a verdict on her. And Courtney Delacroix was not a woman who forgot a verdict. The first real scene I remember was Thanksgiving of 2019. I had made the turkey and the beans and a walnut cake, and Courtney arrived late with a store tray and spent the meal explaining to the table why seed oils were poisoning all of us. And when Gordon said mildly that the food was wonderful, Courtney looked directly at me and said, to the whole table, that of course some people never learned to cook properly and just leaned on whatever their village taught them. Everyone was quiet. Paula looked at her plate. I said that my village had kept people alive through winters Courtney could not imagine, and I passed her the beans, and that was that, on the surface. But under the surface, something had been established. Courtney had learned she could say a thing about me at my own table, and only I would push back. Paula would look at her plate. Gordon would look pained and say nothing, because Gordon avoided conflict the way he avoided unread warranties, on principle and with envelopes. The second scene was in the fall of 2020, when Gordon's heart first faltered. He had a stent put in at Memorial in Modesto, and the fear of it changed the temperature of the whole family. And Courtney, sensing weakness the way she always did, began a slow campaign about the house. Our house was a 1961 ranch on 2/3 of an acre outside Denair, which Gordon and Diane had bought in 1998 and which was, by 2020, worth a great deal more than the $41,000 they had paid for it. Courtney began, always through Paula, always as concern, to ask questions. What would happen to the house if something happened to Gordon? Whether I, the second wife, the immigrant, would end up with what was rightfully Paula's. Whether Diane's memory was being erased. She never asked me directly. She asked Paula, and Paula, checking the room, began to ask me in small, sideways ways, at first apologetically, and then less so, until, by the winter of 2021, my stepdaughter, who had toasted me as the woman still standing, was looking at me across the same kitchen table as if I were a thief who had not yet been caught. The third scene, the one that told me the good years were truly gone, was in March of 2022. Gordon had gone in for a follow-up, and Paula came to the house while he was at the appointment, and she asked me, standing in the doorway of the room we used as an office, whether she could see the deed and the will. Not gently, not as a daughter frightened for her father. She asked the way Courtney had taught her to ask, with a hardness borrowed from a harder woman. And when I said that Gordon kept those documents and she should ask her father, she said a sentence that I carried around in my chest like a swallowed nail for 2 years. She said that everyone knew what women like me came here to do. Women like me. I was 52 years old. I had stood on concrete for 28 years by then. I had made surgical frames that were, at that moment, holding together the hips of people all over the valley. And my husband's daughter, whom I had taught to make my mother's beans, stood in my office doorway and told me what women like me came here to do. I did not answer her. I have thought many times about why I did not answer her, and the honest reason is that I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, I would say something I could not take back. And Gordon loved her, and I loved Gordon. And I had learned in 30 years in this country that the immigrant does not get the luxury of the first outburst. So I said nothing, and I let her leave, thinking she had won the exchange, and that silence was later used against me, because Courtney told the family that I had gone cold and strange, that I would not even discuss the future, that a person with nothing to hide would have shown the girl the papers. This is the thing about a woman like Courtney. She builds the trap out of your own decency and then points at you standing in it. Now I have to tell you about the offense in full, the thing the phone on the truck hood was carrying. And I have to tell you first about a coworker of Paula's named Dion Frost, because he was the hand and Courtney was the mind, and Paula, my Paula, was only the door they walked through. Dion Frost worked in the same medical billing office as Paula. A younger man, clever with computers, one of those people who has learned just enough about technology to be dangerous with it, and not enough to have any wisdom about what it costs. He and Courtney had struck up a friendship through the supplement downline, and somewhere in the winter of 2023, a plan took shape between the two of them, and I have reconstructed most of it since, from the discovery in the case and from what Dion himself eventually admitted. The plan was this. There was a rumor, planted and watered by Courtney, that I had been skimming from Gordon, that money was missing from the household, that the immigrant was finally showing her true face. There was no missing money. Gordon kept his receipts in labeled envelopes by month, remember? But a rumor does not need money to be missing. It only needs people who want it to be true. And Courtney had spent 4 years assembling those people. What Dion did was take dozens of hours of my voice. I had, for 2 years, recorded short voice memos for Gordon's medication schedule because his memory, after the second cardiac event, had gotten unreliable. And I would leave him little spoken reminders that Paula, who helped coordinate his care, had access to through a shared family app. Dion took those recordings, and he fed them into a voice cloning program, the kind that costs almost nothing now, and he built a version of my voice that could say anything he typed. Then, in April of 2023, he manufactured a phone call. He built a recording that sounded like me confessing, in a private call I was supposedly having with a friend, that I had been moving money out of Gordon's accounts for years, that I planned to have the house before he died, that I had married him for exactly the reason Courtney had always said. My voice, my accent, my particular way of pausing before the hard consonants, saying all of it. They did not release it quietly. That was the cruelty of the design. On the evening of May 13th, 2023, at a fundraiser potluck in the parking lot of the Los Rincones Community Church, where perhaps 40 people from the extended family in the community were gathered under strings of cheap, warm lights, Courtney arranged for the recording to be played. She had Dion send it to her phone, and she stood by Dale's truck, and she gathered a knot of people around her with the expression of a woman who has terrible news she is only sharing out of love. And she played my voice off the hood of that truck for anyone who would listen. And I stood there. I had come with a pan of the beans. I set the pan on the tailgate, and I stood there while my own voice, more or less my own voice, told 40 people that I was exactly the thing they had been told I was. I want to be precise about what that is like, because it is the center of everything, and if you have never had it done to you, you will underestimate it. It is not like being accused. Being accused, you can deny. This was my own voice. I opened my mouth to say it was false, and the false thing was already speaking in my voice, more fluent than I was, never pausing before the consonants the way I do when I am upset. And I heard myself, the real me, sounding thick and foreign and flustered next to the smooth, clean lie. And I watched the faces around that truck do the arithmetic and land on the wrong answer. I watched Paula, standing at the edge of the light, put her hand over her mouth. Not in horror at Courtney, in horror at me. My own stepdaughter believed the machine over the woman who had taught her to bake beans. And in that moment, standing by the tailgate with the paprika smell rising off my mother's recipe into the warm May air, I understood that I was, for the length of that recording, entirely alone in the country I had spent 30 years becoming part of. Gordon was not there. He was home, tired from a treatment. If he had been there, it might have gone differently, or it might have killed him, and I have decided it is better that he was home. I drove back to the ranch that night with the untouched pan of beans on the passenger seat, and my eyes stayed dry and my hands stayed loose on the wheel. And that stillness was not strength, not yet. It was shock. The shaking came later, in the weeks when my hands learned to tighten and release on their own. But somewhere on Highway 108 that night, between the church and the house, the shock cooled into something with edges, and by the time I turned into our gravel drive, I was no longer a woman who had been wronged. I was a machinist, looking at a part that was out of tolerance, and thinking, with a cold that surprised even me, about exactly which cut would bring it back to true. Here is the click, the turn, and I want to describe it honestly because it was not dramatic. I did not vow anything. I made a pot of tea, chamomile from the box Gordon liked, and I sat at the kitchen table where Paula had once toasted me, and I asked myself one question, the question I ask on the floor when a job goes wrong. Not who do I blame? The caliber does not blame. The question is, what is the true dimension, and what will it take to prove it? The true dimension was that I had never touched a dollar of Gordon's money, that the recording was a fabrication, and that the fabrication had been played in front of witnesses. Everything they had done to hurt me had also, I realized as I sat there with the chamomile going cold, created evidence. A recording exists somewhere. A recording that is played to a crowd travels through phones. Phones remember. And the family that had turned against me was, in one specific and beautiful way, more exposed than I was, because they had committed their lie to a medium that could be examined, measured, brought into tolerance, or found to be scrap. Now I have to tell you the thing that none of them knew, the thing that changes the shape of this whole story, and I'm going to tell it to you plainly, the way I would tell a foreman a machine had a hidden second spindle. because that is what it was. I was not only a machinist. For 11 years, since 2012, I had also sat on the volunteer board of the Central Valley Iron Workers and Trades Credit Union, a member-owned financial cooperative that had grown out of the old union hall and now served 14,000 working people across 3 counties. I had joined the credit union in 1996 with my second paycheck, and I had risen, slowly, the way I do everything, from member to committee volunteer to elected board member, and by 2023, I was the vice chair of the board and the chair of its lending oversight committee. I did not talk about it at family dinners because it was not the kind of thing my family respected. To Courtney, I was a factory woman with bad knees. To Paula, after Courtney got to her, I was a foreign schemer who could not even cook properly. Nobody at that potluck, playing my stolen voice off a truck hood, had the faintest idea that the woman they were humiliating held, by election of 14,000 members, real and specific authority over exactly the kind of money they cared about. And here is where it becomes precise, where the machine assembles. In the fall of 2022, before any of this broke, Paula and Dale and Courtney had gone in together on a piece of property, a foreclosure they meant to flip, a 4-bedroom on the edge of Ceres that Courtney was certain would double her supplement empire's headquarters and their fortunes both. They needed a mortgage, and because credit unions offer better rates than banks, and because Dale's father was a longtime member, they had applied for that mortgage through the Central Valley Iron Workers and Trades Credit Union, my credit union. The loan had gone through underwriting in early 2023. It sat, as of that May, in the final approval stage. Funds committed, but not yet dispersed, awaiting the board's routine ratification of the quarter's larger lending decisions, which was to say, awaiting the vote of the committee I chaired. They did not know I was on the board. Paula genuinely did not know. I had never told her. It had never come up, because in the years when I might have told her, she had already stopped seeing me as a person with a life of her own. So when they built a machine to destroy me, they built it while their own most cherished plan sat, unratified, in a folder on the desk of the woman they were destroying. I did not engineer that. I want to be clear, because it matters to me, that I did not lure them into my institution. They walked in on their own, chasing a bargain, and the door they walked through happened to be one I had helped build. I did not act on it right away, and I want to explain the patience, because the patience is the whole moral of this for me. A person who has been wronged, and who happens to hold power over the wrongdoer, faces a real temptation. And the temptation is to strike while you are still bleeding, to use the power crudely, to become, in the striking, a version of the thing that hurt you. I had watched Courtney build traps out of other people's decency for 7 years. I was not going to hand her the gift of a reckless act she could point to. If I had simply picked up the phone and killed their loan in a rage in May, I would have been exactly the vindictive foreign schemer the recording described, and Courtney would have won even as she lost. So I did the harder thing. I made the truth first and let the consequence follow the truth. In that order, in daylight, in front of the same witnesses who had watched me be humiliated. The preparation took 5 weeks, and I did it the way I do everything, in order, with a caliper. The first thing I did was call Sandra Ojukwu, who was not only my friend, but the daughter of a friend, a woman I had known since she was a teenager selling raffle tickets for the Union Hall, and who had grown up to be an attorney with a small practice in downtown Modesto that did employment and family law for people who worked with their hands. Sandra came to the ranch on a Tuesday evening, and she sat at my kitchen table, and I made her the beans, and I told her everything. And when I finished, she did not say she was sorry, which I was grateful for, because I did not need sorry. She said, and I remember it exactly, that a deep fake used to defraud a family and defame a person was not a family squabble. It was potentially several crimes and several torts, and that the recording was not their weapon, it was their confession. We just had to get our hands on it. Getting our hands on it was the second thing. I did not have the recording. It had been played off Courtney's phone, and I had been in no state to record it. But 40 people had heard it, and phones had been out, the way phones are always out now. And Sandra advised me to do nothing suspicious, to make no accusations, to simply be present and patient at the ordinary gatherings, and to let people, in their own time, tell me what they had seen. And this is where the small kindness comes in, the one I will never forget. There was a man at that potluck named Ruben Alcaraz, a retired ag mechanic in his 70s who had known Gordon for decades and who had said perhaps 10 words to me in all the years I had been in the family. He was not a friend. He was a quiet old man who fixed smop coolers for the church and kept to himself. 3 weeks after the potluck, Ruben drove out to our ranch on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, and sat in his truck in the gravel until I came out. And then he handed me his phone with his big, oil-stained hands shaking a little. And on his phone was a video. He had been filming the church lights for his granddaughter, who liked the way they looked. And he had, by pure accident, captured the entire thing. Courtney by the truck, the recording playing, my face, all of it in clear sound. He said, in Spanish, because his English was as heavy as my accent, that he had listened to that recording many times at home, and that a real confession does not sound like that. Too smooth, too easy, and that he had made frames of metal too in his day, and he knew a thing that had been machined too clean to be honest when he heard one. Then he said he did not want any trouble, but that Gordon was a good man, and Gordon's wife did not deserve what was done to her, and he asked me to please use the video however I needed. I have never in my life been so undone by a stranger. I made him take a pan of the beans home to his granddaughter, and he did, and I have thought of Ruben Alcaraz every single day since. Ruben's video was the true dimension made visible. It showed the recording being played. It time-stamped it. It captured Courtney's face doing the thing her face did. But it was still only the delivery of the lie. To prove the lie was manufactured, we needed the manufacturer. And that was the third thing, and it took the longest. Sandra brought in a forensic audio analyst named Priya Venkataraman out of a lab in Sacramento who did contract work for the courts. And Priya took the audio from Ruben's video and ran it through her instruments. And what she found was, to me, deeply satisfying, because it was the same principle as my whole trade. The fake was too perfect. A real recording of me, she explained, would carry the acoustic signature of a real room, the reflections, the background, the small imperfections of a human throat under stress. The fake carried none of that. It carried instead the faint mathematical fingerprints of the generation software, artifacts in the high frequencies that the human ear glides past, but the instruments do not. The same kind of tell that a machined too clean surface has, exactly as Ruben had heard with his old mechanic's ear. Priya wrote a report. The report said, in careful, expert language, that the recording was synthetic, generated, false. The caliper had spoken. The part was scrap. The fourth thing was the money trail. And here Sandra was patient with me because I wanted to prove I had never taken $1, and she made me understand that I did not have to. Gordon's labeled envelopes did that for us, month by month, back years. Every receipt, every reconciled account. There was no missing money because I had never taken any. And a forensic accountant Sandra retained for 2 afternoons confirmed it in a 2-page letter that was almost boring in how complete it was. Boring is what innocence looks like when it is documented. I have kept that letter. And the fifth thing, the thing I did entirely on my own and told no one until it was done, concerned the credit union and my own conscience. Because I held real power over their loan, I could not simply use it. That would have been a corruption of the trust 14,000 members had elected me to hold, and I would not do it, not even against Courtney. So I went to the credit union's general counsel, a straight, dry woman named Frances Boland, and I disclosed everything, fully, before I acted, in writing. I told her that applicants on a pending loan had defamed me with a fabricated recording, that I was a victim in a matter that touched a borrower before our board, and I asked her not for a favor, but for a ruling on what my duty was. And Frances Boland, after review, gave me the answer that made everything possible, and it was not the answer of a favor. She told me that the credit union had, in its lending covenants, a standard and long-standing clause requiring that borrowers not be engaged in fraud or material misrepresentation, and that a loan application from parties credibly implicated in manufacturing fraudulent evidence raised exactly the kind of reputational and legal risk that the Lending Oversight Committee existed to catch. The forensic report on the recording was, she said, precisely the sort of material fact the board was obligated to consider before ratifying funds. I was not to vote on it myself, given my conflict, but I was, as chair, entirely within my duty to place the report before the committee and let the other members act on the institution's own rules. Do you see the shape of it now? I did not need to abuse my power. I only needed to bring the truth into the room where the money was and let the institution's own honest rules do what they were built to do. The very cleanness that had been used against me, the machine that was too perfect, became the material fact that a lawful body was required to consider. I did not have to become Courtney. I only had to be a machinist and put the measured part on the table. Now the reckoning. And it happened, as these things do, faster than the 7 years it took to build to it. It happened before the weekend was over. Sandra had filed. In the late spring of 2023, she brought a civil action against Courtney Delacroix and Dion Frost for defamation and for the fraudulent creation and distribution of the recording, and she had referred the matter to the Stanislaus County District Attorney because the impersonation and the fabrication crossed lines the state takes seriously. There was a hearing on a Friday morning in June at the county courthouse in Modesto on Sandra's motion regarding the preservation and authentication of evidence. And by then, word had traveled, the way word does in a valley where everyone's cousin knows everyone's foreman, that the recording that had ruined Gordon Merriweather's wife might not be what people had been told it was. The same 40 people who had heard my voice betray me had heard, by June, that there was going to be a hearing, and a number of them came. They came to the courthouse steps in Modesto on that Friday morning, the way people come to see whether a thing they believed was true. Paula came. Courtney came, because Courtney could not stay away from a stage. Dion Frost came with a lawyer who already had the look of a man who had read the forensic report. And I came in the one good jacket I own, with Sandra beside me and Priya Venkataraman's report in a folder. And I stood on the courthouse steps in the flat, bright valley morning, while Sandra, in the plain hallway before we went in, laid the report and Ruben's authenticated video and the forensic accountant's boring, beautiful letter in front of Dion's lawyer. And I watched that lawyer read the first page and the second page and then stop reading and close the folder, because a man who reads warranties knows when the warranty has run out. I will tell you how each of them met it, because the brief of a person's character is written in the moment the truth arrives, and I watched all three. Dion Frost broke first and cleanest. He was young, and he was frightened, and his lawyer had clearly already told him that a synthetic media fraud with a forensic report attached was not a thing he wanted to take in front of a jury in an agricultural county full of people who distrust exactly that kind of cleverness. On the steps before we ever went inside, Dion asked to speak, and Sandra allowed it with his lawyer present, and Dion admitted, in a low, fast voice, that he had built the recording, that Courtney had asked him to, that she had told him it was a joke that got out of hand, and then told him it was necessary, and then stopped calling it anything at all. He said he was sorry. I believe he was sorry, in the narrow way of a person who is sorry to be caught. But I also believe he understood, standing there, that he had taken my actual voice, the voice I carried from Skopje, and used it to try to unmake my actual life, and that some part of that had reached him. He entered into an agreement that afternoon. He cooperated fully against Courtney. His life did not end, but it was permanently rearranged, and that was correct. Courtney Delacroix did not break, and I want to be honest that she never did, not that day and not since, because a person like Courtney does not have the interior architecture to break. She only has walls, and when the walls are hit, she builds new ones. On the steps, confronted with the report and the video and the confession of her own accomplice, she did not go pale, and she did not beg. She got louder. She said it was a witch hunt. She said the report was bought. She said I had connections she had always suspected. And in that last accusation, she stumbled, without knowing it, onto the edge of the truth. Because I did have a connection she had never suspected, and it was about to end her differently than the courtroom would. She was charged. Her case would grind on for a year and a half and end in a conviction and a sentence and a civil judgment she is still paying down. But she never admitted a thing. Some parts are scrap and know it. Some parts are scrap and go to the shredder still insisting they are intolerance. Courtney was the second kind, and I have made my peace with the fact that the world contains her kind, and that the most you can do is measure them accurately and remove them from the assembly. And Paula. My Paula stood on the courthouse steps at the edge of the group, exactly the way she had stood at the edge of the church lights, and I watched the truth arrive in her the way water arrives in dry ground, slowly and then all at once. She heard Dion say he had built it. She heard him say Courtney had directed it. She heard, from Sandra reading aloud the summary of the forensic report so the gathered witnesses would understand, that the voice they had all believed was mine had never once passed my lips, that it was a machine wearing my accent, and that the woman she had looked at across the church lot with her hand over her mouth had been, in the most literal and provable sense, telling the truth all along. And Paula's face did the thing that Courtney's face was incapable of doing. It broke open. She looked at me, and I saw her go back through it. The deed she had demanded, the women like me she had said in my office doorway, the hand over her mouth, the 7 years of Courtney's patient carving, and I watched her understand that she had let a stronger, crueler person hollow her out and fill her with a lie about the one woman who had taught her, on Sunday afternoons, to feed people. She did not speak. She could not. She sat down on the courthouse steps in her church clothes, and she put her face in her hands. And the witnesses around her, the same people who had believed the recording, looked from her to me. And I saw, on face after face, the correction happen. Ruben Alcaraz was there, and he took off his cap. That was the vindication. Not the ruling inside, the faces on the steps, doing the arithmetic again and landing this time on the truth. That was Friday. Now the card, and the timing, because it happened, as I promised you, before the weekend was over. On Saturday morning, the Lending Oversight Committee of the Central Valley Ironworkers and Trades Credit Union held its regularly scheduled quarterly ratification meeting, which had been on the calendar for months and which happened, by nothing more than the ordinary rhythm of institutions, to fall the day after the hearing. I had, weeks before, following Francis Boland's guidance to the letter, submitted the forensic report and the relevant materials into the committee's packet as a material fact bearing on the pending mortgage application of Delacroix, and the co-applicant, because our covenants required consideration of borrower fraud, and because it was my duty as chair to bring known material facts before the body. I recused myself from the vote, as was proper. I sat at the end of the table and I said nothing, while the other 4 members of the committee, working people all of them, a welder and a nurse and 2 retired tradesmen, read the report and asked their questions of Francis Boland and reached their own conclusion under the institution's own rules. And on that Saturday, by a vote I did not cast, the committee declined to ratify the funding of the loan and referred the application back on the grounds of credible evidence of borrower fraud. The loan was frozen, not by my hand. By the honest machine I had spent 11 years helping to keep honest, fed the true dimension, and left to do its work. Here is what that meant in plain terms, so a listener grasps it instantly, because the money is not the point, but the sound of the trap closing is. Courtney had built her whole next act on that foreclosure flip in series. She had put down earnest money. She had made commitments to the seller with a closing date that assumed the credit union's funds. When the loan froze on Saturday, the closing collapsed, the earnest money was forfeit under the purchase contract, the seller moved to the backup offer by Monday, and the empire Courtney had been building on the ruin of my name came apart in a single weekend, brought down not by revenge, but by the simple institutional fact that a member-owned cooperative does not lend to people credibly shown to have manufactured fraud. She had reached, on the courthouse steps, for the accusation that I had connections. She never learned how exactly right she had been, or that the connection she had blindly accused me of was the honest rules of an institution she had chosen, all on her own, to bring her fortune to. Before the weekend was over then, this was the state of things. Dion had confessed and turned. Courtney was charged, and her flip was dead, and her forfeit earnest money gone, and her name, in a valley where names travel, permanently altered. And Paula sat in the wreckage of a lie she had helped carry, having watched, in front of every witness who had doubted me, the machine of the actual truth grind slowly and completely into the light. Back in the present, back in my kitchen on that ordinary morning with the beans soaking and the almond shaker applauding across the fields, you can understand now why my hands were still, and why Paula was reading a therapy appointment card out loud like a bus schedule in a language she is still learning. Because I did not throw her out. This is the part people find hardest to believe, and it is the part I am most certain of. Gordon lived another 1.5 years after that June, and he died in the winter of 2024, with his daughter and his wife both at his bedside. And before he died, he made Paula and me promise him one thing, which was that we would tell each other the truth, always, out loud, no matter how thick the accent or how long the pause before the hard consonant. And I have kept that promise, and so, to my genuine surprise, has Paula. She is not living in my house because I am soft. Let me be exact about that, because softness is what Courtney mistook me for, and it cost her everything. I hold now every card. The civil judgment from that summer named Paula only marginally, and I chose, from a position of complete strength, not to pursue her. And everyone, including Paula, knows I made that choice and could unmake it. The house is mine, cleanly, provably, with Gordon's labeled envelopes and a will he wrote in daylight with 2 witnesses. I sit still on the board that froze the loan. If I wanted Paula gone, one plainly worded sentence from me would end her welcome. And she knows this, and I know this, and the knowing is the ground we now stand on. She lives here and goes to her Thursday therapy and helps me make my mother's beans on Sundays for the church that Ruben Alcaraz still fixes swamp coolers for, because after everything broke open, she came to me on this same floor and asked whether a person who had let herself be turned into a weapon could ever be set back to true. And I told her the truth, which is that a part that has been machined wrong can sometimes be reground, but only by someone patient, and only if the part holds still and lets it happen. She is holding still. She checks the room less than she used to before she laughs. Courtney is out of her life entirely, by Paula's own choice, which is the single act that most convinced me she meant it. Because leaving the stronger person who hollowed you out is the hardest thing a follower ever does. And I stay, not because I need her, and not because I forgave in the soft way that lets a thing happen again, but because I looked at the whole assembly with the cold, clear eye I bring to a job, and I decided, from strength and not from weakness, that this particular reconstruction was worth the work. I have thought a great deal in the 2 years since about what the whole thing taught me, And it is not the thing you would expect a woman to learn who was nearly unmade by a recording. It is not about paper, and it is not about the deed, and it is not even really about the truth being provable, though God knows I am grateful that it was. It is this. They built a version of my voice that was smoother than my own, cleaner, more fluent, with no pause before the hard consonants. And they nearly convinced a whole community that the polished, false thing was more real than the rough, true one. And what I know now, in my hands and not just my head, is that the pause before the hard consonant is not the flaw. The pause is the person. The roughness is the proof of a real throat, a real life, a real woman who came here at 24 with an address in ballpoint on her wrist and stood on concrete for 30 years. A thing machined too clean to be honest gives itself away, and a woman rough enough to be real is worth more, in the end, than any smooth lie told in her stolen voice. And no downline, no deepfake, and no daughter turned into a weapon by a crueler hand can measure her worth for her. That is a thing I now do for myself, with my own caliper, and I do not lend the instrument to anyone.